Back when I was in my early 30s, for a very short time, I worked at a very small ranch in southwestern Montana. Having only worked at this ranch for around 19 or 20 months, we had our handful of issues. The biggest being something that you probably won't exactly believe me. So I'm just going to tell you. What the owner called them was buffalo wolves, if that's even a real thing. I had never even heard that name up until his mentioning of them. He thought they were some extinct form of wolves that have been around for a long time. But I guess this was actually a much more advanced species of wolf than I had ever come to know. I had seen them myself on several different occasions, tearing into livestock, being smart enough to manipulate parts of the fence to make it seamless, like they had never even crossed there, or even as far as covering their tracks, like a stealthy thief looking to break and enter in. All these things pointed to something other than a wolf, something far more advanced in intelligence, something far more human-like. Like I said, after having seen them myself, I know too much now. I don't claim to be an expert, but whatever you want to call them, buffalo wolves or what, these creatures are real, and they share far more many human-like characteristics than I'd like to think. For starters, I saw them clear as day stand, walk, and live on two legs, just like a human being would, having no problems maneuvering or walking around, acting just fine. They also appear to move down onto all fours, like that of a quadrupedal animal, again, having no problems ever shifting between one or the other. Also, in my mind, this presented an issue of balance. Most animals, I'd like to think, if not all, that walk on all four, simply can't walk on two. The balance of their body can't support two legs. But the way these animals' bodies were built, it was just so unnatural. Even the upper chest, the shoulders and the arms, looked far too human-like. Everything about this animal was wrong. I'm very fortunate that I have not had any personal run-ins, at least any that were up close or violent, thank the Lord. But the owner, on the other hand, had some personal accounts that he would never go into detail. He was always too scared to talk about it. Gee, I wonder why. Before I decided to sit down and write this, I thought I would educate myself, read up on other, what they call dogman encounters, or even through some of your episodes. And while after listening to many of them, I guess I should say that I'm surprised but not surprised by all the similarities that I too experienced. Like I had mentioned, the intelligence. But I didn't deal so much with the aggressiveness as many of the other people that you talk about. But instead of seeing livestock slaughtered, I witnessed them stealing them and taking them off into the north end of the ranch where they were coming through the forest. What happened to the livestock? I can only guess they were eaten. But personally, I was never tasked with going out and finding the cadavers or any remains. That was well beyond my pay grade. And I think the owner actually liked me, so he never wanted to task me with such things. I have no idea if he did himself. But any time that he knew these things were taken, or taking his livestock, he would just count that as a loss. He also seemed really apprehensive about doing any sort of self-defense against these animals, creatures, whatever you're wanting to call them. I don't know. Some sort of bio-anomaly. Because I've never seen an animal that acted more like a human. I guess maybe if you think of an ape. But this was frighteningly smart. These things' overall ability to problem solve, think ahead, strategize, work in groups, and have a complete, actual understanding of the environment around them and how to work it to their good or their desire is just as frightening as it is admirable. I don't know if these creatures dwell in certain areas of the country, Or maybe they're just a West Coast anomaly. Maybe they live on the East Coast. But again, after listening to many encounters, reading many encounter stories, they seem to be everywhere. Not just in one part of the US, but even Canada, Europe, Australia, even parts of India, I take it. I'm not sure what they are. I would think that they are some sort of common species of unknown animal. But maybe animal isn't even a term we should refer to them by, just because of how much like us they are. But back to my writing. And this is something that I witnessed firsthand. There were two of them that I saw, a larger one and a smaller one. The larger one wasn't as big as the largest one that we had saw, which I believe to be the alpha male. This one, I guess you could call a medium-sized one, was roughly 6 to 7 feet in height. Pretty decent build, and the smaller one was probably closer to 5 feet, maybe a tad bit under, much more slender in build. I don't know how much younger it was, which I'm assuming was younger. They were both running in a group. When the big one, or bigger one, stopped and noticed it left tracks on the ground, it quickly did a hand gesture to the smaller one, alerted it down to the ground, and they both began intelligently covering up their tracks. At least that's what I assumed they were doing, considering there was grass in the way, and the soil was soft. If you were to walk over there, you would leave tracks in it with your boots. Well, the very next day, there was no sign of any tracks being over there. My boots did leave a mark, though, in the soft soil. That's how I know, and that's how I came to the conclusion that they were marking up their tracks at the time. When I saw them do this the previous evening, I wasn't exactly sure what they were doing, until the next day, when I realized they were indeed covering up tracks. How they did it, I'm not sure, because even as I stepped back and kicked dirt over my own tracks, trying to replicate any way that they could to cover up the tracks, it didn't quite fully work, and I don't have a great way to accurately describe how to cover up soil, at least the way these things did. But I will say that being as large as they are, there is no way that they cannot leave tracks. I'm only 200 pounds soaking wet, and even I left a considerable impression in the soft soil with my boots. These things being much larger in density and mass, they had to know what they were doing. No animal I've ever heard of is able to go back and cover their own tracks. What kind of predators exactly are we dealing with? Well, my 19 or 20 months would be up, and I moved out of state, down to Northern California. I eventually lost contact with the owner, because I think he either moved or changed his number. I'm not sure, but I don't really want to go back to think about what he had to deal with. And we didn't really talk about the whole Buffalo Wolf thing a whole bunch. It was talked about sometimes and mentioned here or there. Enough that I guess you can consider it a topic at hand, but it was not a part of our daily activity or daily conversation. It was only brought up every once in a while, and very brief, if anything. Although there were conversations of concern here and there. Enough that I knew they existed, after having seen them myself. I thought I would send this in to you, and add in my 2 cents of my encounter with these dogman animals, or creatures or beings. I'm not sure what you refer to them as, but either way, I know they're out there. I know they exist, and who truly knows what they are capable of? This was back sometime in March or April of 2013. It was just beginning to get springtime, but not quite. It was still pretty foggy and rainy, but not freezing yet, or at least it was past the freezing part. I was on Facebook and got a message from a close friend of mine. I hadn't spoken to him in about over a month, and we were pretty decent friends. We would talk on and off. Anyway, he had a habit of randomly inviting me over for a little get-together or party, and I always gave in. This night, it was roughly 7:30. He shot me a message, asked me if I was available to come hang out with him and a few mutual friends of ours. I said yes, told me to be there around 9, in an hour and a half. I got ready, and he lives about 25 minutes away from me, a little bit out of town, where there's a lot less houses. Where his house is kind of up on a hill, surrounded by a bunch of trees. The front of his house is not like a typical driveway. It's kind of just dirt, with about 4, 5, or 6 cars parked out in front, and a really bright floodlight. You kind of pull off this dirty gravel road, right up to his house, and that's it. In the back of his house is a really large hill that kind of slopes down, where he has a large bonfire, and woods surrounding all of that. That's only relevant to include because, well, that's where we'd usually party and have fun, not having to worry about neighbors, since there were really none close by him, at least not for a half a mile in either direction. Now, going out to his house, everything was fine. It was a little foggy, but dark, somewhat clear skies, not rainy. I think it was a little wet, considering the time of year. I pull up to his house, and the floodlight comes on. As soon as I do, I see this large shape of a dog, the largest dog I've ever seen in my life, jump out from behind his Ford, right next to my car, off into the bushes. I was kind of freaked out. This thing easily was the size of a lion. You know, lions from Africa, like a savanna lion, something that could easily pounce and kill you. I remember pretty clearly jumping out of my car and running to the back of his yard, just because I was so spooked. I told him, and I said, "Dude, you have a flipping lion in your front yard." And he kind of looked at me strangely and laughed, thinking I was already drunk or something. And I explained to him what happened. Him and his sister, and a couple of our other mutual friends who were already there, were curious, but they kind of laughed it off, thinking that I was either playing a prank or just joking around. I kept going on about how serious I was, and what I saw did indeed happen. Well, they paid no notion to that, and kind of went on doing their thing. As the night went on, we quickly forgot all about the whole giant wolf dog thing that I saw. At least, that's what the shape looked like. A giant dog. I didn't see any details because it was so dark. And the floodlight that came on the front of his house, which by the way is super bright, only gave details to a large silhouette. As the night went on, probably closer to midnight, I had drinking a little, but I was only buzzed. My friend who invited me over was beginning to black out. He's a much heavier drinker than I, and although I enjoy it, I prefer social drinking more. I've never been a fan of getting drunk. I like a buzz here and there, like anyone else, but that's about where I stop. My other mutual friends, who had later on arrived, they were all getting pretty buzzed too, somewhere between there and drunk. That's when we started hearing noises off in the woods in the distance. Between the bonfire and the entrance of the woods, maybe 200 yards. It's pretty large open space. I mean, you could easily go ATVing. I think there were woods and trees around here at some point, but long before my friend bought the property, it was all cleared and torn out, so it's just a giant clearing. Well, we heard all sorts of crashing woods and noises, sounding like a large animal crashing through the trees, making all sorts of noises. I didn't hear any howling or any other animal noises, just the crashing sound, like something big trampling about. I'm trying to paint this picture for you. Imagine the Hulk, and put him in the middle of the woods in a dark forest at nighttime. Imagine the noise he would make, moving around, pushing trees over, stomping around. You would probably guess that there's some sort of heavy machinery going around. Well, yeah, that's just how loud it was. Except there was no machinery sounds accompanying it. It was just crashing, thrashing. And while some of our friends were mildly concerned, I say mildly, because their state of inebriation took over more control than their actual sobering concern of what was in the woods. I was the only one that really began to get nervous, and this went on for quite a while, maybe close to an hour off and on, and then suddenly stopped, along with all the sounds of the night. Crickets, even the wind. It was dead silent. Now, it was about 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and most everybody but I was pretty drunk. So much so, they were able to ignore any eeriness that was felt in the air. Sitting out there in the quiet for maybe 10-15 minutes, I made the announcement that I'm going to go inside, lay down, and that they should all come inside with me, that we should put out the bonfire and put in a night. Some of them agreed, my other friend being so drunk that he was pretty much out. Whatever. I know it was probably a mistake, but I left him out there. 2/3 of us, I would say, decided to put out the fire and go in, while the other few sat outside, still talking. They came in at some point, but I had fallen asleep. Luckily, my friend had a pretty large house and a very large living room. Many places on the floor to crash. He had mattresses and pads all over, so it wasn't hard to find a spot to crash down on and lay on. I mean, he had his living room set up, so that way 10 or 15 people at a time could crash out. Pretty nice setup, actually, and it worked out in our favor. Not to mention the giant window panes all over the walls, meaning you could perfectly see out to the bonfire area and where all the woods was. Even though I was pretty creeped out and a little buzzed still, I decided I should try and fall asleep, and miraculously, I did. The next day, I had woken up. Everybody was inside. I was one of the first ones up, and decided I should head home. But I talked to my friend first, and asked him how things were going, and then I told him I was very uncomfortable the previous night. He said when he got up to go back in the house, since he was one of the last ones, he told me he had this intense feeling like something or somebody was watching him. He had looked around, but not seen anybody. But he told me that this sounds weird, because it coincides with what I told him, that he felt like something or somebody was watching him through the woods. I asked him could it have been neighbors who were coming over to try and maybe play tricks on us, but he told me no. The only neighbor who lives about a half-mile away in that direction is an elderly couple. There's no reason they would be going through the woods over to his property around 1:30 or later in the morning. For what reason? This couple was at least 80. I think the man was in a wheelchair even. There's no way or reason that would be a thing. Anyway, I know this is probably a dumb story, but my friend totally got the creeps. We never did figure out what that silhouette of the large dog was, or what the crashing sounds were in the woods, but I can't help but find it awfully fishy that weird stuff happened to not only me, but him as well, and we both acknowledged it. Everybody else, though, seemed to downplay it severely, like maybe they knew, but they really didn't want to know. Anyway, like I said, this was back in 2013. I've had no sort of experiences since then. It has really been the only thing that I've had that was weird remotely, and I've been out there many times since that day. Again, with nothing weird happening. So maybe it was a fluke. I'm not sure. Maybe we truly did encounter a dogman that night. We'll never know, I guess. I just hope that it never decides to come back. I'm really glad I found your channel, and while I've been debating about writing this into you, about the whole experience and wondering if it truly fits in with any of your stories, I thought, hey, why not? If you don't decide to use it, it is what it is. But if you do, I really hope your listeners can appreciate what I have to say. Now, let's back this up a little. The man in question is and was a good friend of mine. Up until around the end of 2016, died of a massive heart attack. Sometime before Thanksgiving, if I remember correctly. I'm not going to say his actual name, so I'll refer to him as Earl. Earl eventually found God, cleaned up his life, and became a pretty decent guy. But, pre-2000s, He was a bad guy to mess with. In and out of prison, sold and did a lot of drugs, did a lot of bad things, even murdered people. But his primary occupation was a pimp for at least 8 or 9 years. And during that time, he had some crazy stories that he shared with me. One being something about werewolves. Now, get this. So, at the time that him being a pimp, he rolled over, I guess if that's the correct terminology, a handful of prostitutes. He operated them in this really shady part of town, off in the outskirts, where it was a little bit more wooded, tucked away, but just as much a part of the city as any other part would be. Of course, with all the gang rivalry and gang banging, there would always be violence, and, of course, drugs being sold. I should also clarify that if you're not familiar with slang, gang banging is not referring to an orgy, but actual gang activity, killing, violence, any sort of gang activity that you can think of, at least to my knowledge. While that was going around in plentiful amounts, there was also prostitutes going missing left and right. Now, on occasion this does happen. If you go to any major metropolis and you talk to any pimp, which I hope you wouldn't do, because they are dangerous men, but sometimes prostitutes are kidnapped. Sometimes they're killed. They are in a way seen as property of other pimps, so it makes sense that rival pimps would do this. But there was a horrible, horrible reason for this. Some of the prostitutes, who were friends with the other prostitutes, kept claiming that they would see this large black dog with tall pointed ears walking on 2 legs, which they would refer to as a werewolf, keep coming after the other prostitutes, attacking them, and eventually, multiple of these prostitutes would disappear. At least 5 of them in this same little area all vanished without a trace. Before truly finding out what was the cause of this, he ended up serving a prison term and getting out. And shortly after that, it was about at the end of his gang life, which would mean he turned over his life completely afterwards. So that was just a closed chapter. He never did find out. And I'm just telling you all this to give a backstory to the reasoning. He told me it always bothered him, and he found it weird, that his prostitutes kept referring to the same description of what they were seeing. Of course, he would beat them, mock them, force them to do stuff on him, as well as other people for more money, because he thought they were trying to get out of it. But he just now can't get around the fact that they would use the same descriptions, the tall pointed black ears, the fact that it looked, whatever it was, like a werewolf. He doesn't really believe in werewolves or anything like that. He's just more haunted that they would go missing, all saying that they saw this same creature or thing, and wonders if there's a reason behind that. I'm sorry I don't know as much information as I'd like to. I wish I would have talked to him more about it. But when he had shared it with me, I always found it very interesting, thinking at the time that the idea of a werewolf was a possibility. Now that I know about the idea of cryptids and that they do exist, and the whole phenomenon with dogmen, I almost wonder if indeed that's what they were seeing. I should also state that this period of him prostituting these girls out was somewhere in the 90s. I think 1991 to 99 is to be exact, but I can't quite remember for sure, but it was sometime around there. And I also want to say too that the area these prostitutes served in was somewhere close by to Chicago. It wasn't a sect of Chicago if I remember right. It was a little bit past that, but still a busy area, just a little bit more forested than a big city. When I was 17, I used to hang out with my buddy, literally all the time during the summertime. We really had nothing else better to do. And I can distinctly remember one evening, we were bored. I think I had about $8 or $9, and I told my friend, hey, let's go walk to the store, get some Mountain Dews. Come back and we'll play video games. We did those things already, but for whatever reason, I was really craving a Mountain Dew then. I don't know why. So, he agreed, and we both walked down to the store. Now, the store was quite a bit of ways away, and you had to walk through this really sketchy long stretch of road that had thick woods on both sides. Being in California, at least middle to upper California, these were forests, like the kind of forest you see in the Pacific Northwest, not the shrubbery and loose woods that you see down in Southern California. I thought I should make that distinction. We had walked this stretch of road many times. I think it was a little over a mile, maybe a mile and a half. But we would go there often to get snacks, soda, and whatever stuff that a 17-year-old eats. Well, this time was really no different. And it being the summer evening, the sun was still out, and it was still beautiful weather. Active people walking their dogs, and cars going back and forth. It wasn't a dead road by any means, but there were fewer houses. I'm wanting to say all this stuff because I want to mention that this was a very lively area. Maybe not as lively as any downtown area, but there were people present, cars going by, as I just said. We were maybe halfway there to the store, when we heard strange noises off to the forest across the street. It made us both stop, look at each other, and question, what was that we had just heard? It sounded like a dog getting ripped apart, or something. Maybe like a cougar attacking a dog. I think after discussing it for a moment, that was the conclusion we came to. But it didn't quite sound like that. And living in California, I've had my fair share of hearing cougars, although I've only heard a few dogs. But this is exactly what it would sound like. So, we kept on walking, going back on our conversation of whatever it was we were talking about. Maybe 10 minutes later, we're now nearing the end of the walk, and we hear it again, except this time the noises are more distorted and closer, as if whatever it was following us parallel in the woods. This time, though, the sounds were different. It didn't sound like another animal attacking a dog or something. And when I mentioned it the first time, I mentioned the accompanying noises of a cougar making noise like a hissing sound, along with the whimpering and whining of a dog, even though they didn't sound quite right, not like you'd actually hear. I know it's very hard to explain, but when we got near the end of the walk and we heard these noises again, they were different. It's almost like the sound of a dog and the hissing of a cat or something like that was overlaid on top of each other. It sounded very large and very distorted, like playing through a lo-fi radio or something. And whatever it was seemed to sound really big. Like, imagine a bison making that noise. Something of enormous size. It's really hard to describe accurately. My friend and I just kept looking at each other, like, what on earth is making those noises? There were some passerbyers on the other end of the street, a biker, and a lady walking her German Shepherd, all three of which, including the dog, made glances at the noises and seemed to carry on. The lady, if I remember right, even had her headphones in, and I remember that she looked over too, signifying that me and my friend were not indeed crazy, and we were hearing something strange and out of the ordinary. So here's where the story gets even crazier. We go to the store, and we both load up on Mountain Dew, since being 17, you seem to think you're really cool if you drink Mountain Dew. I'm really not sure what my obsession was at that age. So we're leaving, and we're about halfway back down this long stretch of road. Keep in mind, it's probably somewhere between 7 and 8, in the midst of summer. 7 or 8, I think. And it's still sunny out. Cars are still going by. There's still people walking. It's still lively. It's California after all. The noises begin to even get more violent sounding, if that makes any sense. It sounded like a flock of animals being ripped apart, minus the skin-ripping noises and blood and tissues being torn. I don't know how else to accurately tell you. That's what it sounded like. Like you would hear a roar, and overlaid with that roar was what sounded like distorted dog screams. I don't know. My friend, when we ended up getting back, said that he might think it might be a skinwalker. But I don't know. It didn't sound far off into the woods, and I had never even heard of a skinwalker before. He ended up telling me what a skinwalker was. He's not native, but he does have native friends, and has heard of what they are before. Except we were in California, nowhere near any reservation that I am or was aware of at the time. Well, come to find out later that night, people in that area had reported seeing a large, strange, upright canine figure in the area. I know this because he called a friend of his, or maybe it was a family member, one or the other, I can't quite remember, and they were talking about the weird noises that we had just heard a few hours prior. He got in the conversation over the phone, and since his friend, or family member, whichever it was on speakerphone, he didn't know he was on speakerphone, was talking about it, and saying that yeah, the whole neighborhood's kind of freaked out right now. They're not sure what it was. And I almost motioned to him, asking if he meant werewolf. My friend mentioned the word werewolves, and he said, nah, that's not what it was. It's something else entirely. Some strange animal, we don't know what it is. And then the rest of the conversation went as normal. And since then, I've always had this thing that I do believe that werewolves or animals like that exist somewhere. Maybe a skinwalker, maybe a werewolf, I don't know. Out here in California, though, I wouldn't put it past me that something weird is out there lurking in the darkness of the woods.